The flavors of home. There was a man named Amir who had left the warm, bustling streets of his homeland in search of a better life in a land where the language was foreign and the traditions were unlike his own. The country he moved to was vast and cold, the air thin, and the people distant. But Amir's hope was as firm as the roots of an ancient tree, and his heart carried the fire of a dream. He had come to the land of opportunities, a place that offered a chance at prosperity, a chance for his children to grow up in peace and freedom. However, there was something inside him that gnawed at him, a yearning he couldn't shake. The land he came from, with its vibrant markets, the smell of spices, and the warmth of family around the table, haunted him every moment. He had made it far from home, but the distance between his heart and the life he led now felt infinite. He carried on learning the language, adopting the customs, and blending into the fabric of his new world. He became part of the community, and soon enough, he was just another face in the crowd. Yet, with each passing day, something was missing. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon when Amir was sitting outside his modest apartment building, making his way through a bowl of stewed lamb and barley, when his neighbor, Jane, approached him. She was a young woman, in her late 20s, always with a book in hand, always with questions in her eyes. She had noticed his cooking, the way the scent of his meals wafted through the building's halls and into the courtyard where she often spent time reading. Today, she was standing there, intrigued by the aroma that had reached her in waves. "What are you making today?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Amir looked up, his eyes a little sad, a little distant, but there was something warm in them when he spoke. "It's a dish from my country, a bit of home in this foreign land." Jane smiled, sensing the depth behind his words. "Would you mind telling me about it?" And so it began. Their conversations, small at first, turned into something more profound. Every time Jane came to ask about the dishes Amir made, he would tell her stories of his homeland, stories of his youth, his family, and the traditions that bound his heart to the land that was so far away. He spoke of the marketplaces filled with colors and life, of the festivals that stretched late into the night, and of the food that was more than just sustenance. It was a connection, a bond. As he shared these memories, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Amir's once quiet and solitary existence was transformed by the spark of curiosity in Jane's eyes. One day, she asked, "Could you teach me how to make one of your dishes?" The request was simple, yet it stirred something deep inside Amir. Cooking was more than just preparing a meal. It was a way to preserve his identity. It was how he stayed connected to the people he had left behind, to the soil that had nurtured him, to the customs that had shaped him. But he agreed. He invited her into his kitchen, a space that had always been just for him, and they began to cook together. As the days passed, more than neighbors took an interest. They gathered around, asking questions, eager to learn about the flavors that Amir brought from his homeland. At first, it was the food that drew them in. The rich stews, the fragrant rice dishes, the delicate pastries. But soon, they began to ask about the stories behind the food. What was the history of the spices? How did this dish come to be? What did it mean to Amir to make these meals? With each passing meal, Amir felt his heart swell, but also break. The more he shared with them, the more he felt the loss of his family and his homeland. He had once feared that, in the pursuit of a better life, he might lose himself. But now, as he taught his neighbors how to prepare the dishes he had grown up with, he realized something. Perhaps in the sharing, he could keep the essence of his heritage alive. Through the people he had met in this new land, he could find a bridge between the past and the future, between the old world and the new. But as Amir opened up to his neighbors, he began to notice something strange. Each time he shared a dish, each time he told a story, there were moments when the air would grow unnaturally cold, and a dark shadow seemed to linger just at the edge of his vision. He shrugged it off at first, attributing it to his exhaustion, to the weight of living in two worlds at once. But the unease grew. Sometimes, when he looked at Jane or the others, their expressions would shift, just for a moment. Faces would distort, eyes would gleam with an unnatural light. He started to question his own mind, wondering if the stress of adapting to his new life was causing him to lose his grip on reality. One evening, as they gathered around the table for another meal, something happened that he could not explain. The lights flickered, the smell of the spices seemed to grow more intense, and an oppressive silence filled the room. Jane, who had always been so lively and eager, was now motionless, her eyes wide with an expression he had never seen before. The others around the table were still, as if trapped in a dream. Amir's heart raced as he reached out to Jane, but before he could speak, she whispered, "It's time." "What do you mean?" Amir asked, his voice shaking. "You've shared your story, Amir," she said softly, "but there's more. The story is not just for you to tell. It's for you to live. The spirits of your ancestors, they've been waiting for you to remember." Amir froze. The air was thick with a presence, something ancient, something that had been there all along. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Or was it a product of his yearning, his loneliness? Then, a deep voice, low and resonant, seemed to echo in his mind. "You have brought us here, Amir. You have remembered the old ways. Now, you must give us what we have come for." Suddenly, the room was filled with a swirling darkness, a fog that crept in from the corners, and for a moment, Amir saw it. His ancestors, their faces stern and solemn, their eyes filled with longing. They had not come for the food. They had come for the stories, for the memories, for the life that Amir had left behind but had never truly abandoned. "You've brought us back," one of them said, "but there is still a price." The room seemed to pulse with a terrifying energy, and Amir felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. He had tried to leave his past behind, to build a new life. But the past, it seemed, had never left him. The spirits, the stories, the heritage, everything was part of him. He could no longer run from it. But then, as quickly as it had started, the darkness receded. The room returned to normal. The fog dissipated, and Amir was left standing there, breathless. Jane looked at him with wide eyes, as if she had witnessed something extraordinary. The others at the table seemed confused, unsure of what had just happened. Amir, shaken to his core, took a deep breath. He realized that he could no longer ignore the call of his ancestors. He had tried to adapt, to change, but in doing so, he had distanced himself from the very essence of who he was. The price had been paid, but the lesson was clear. He could not live without the stories, the traditions, the connections that had shaped him. With a new understanding of who he was, Amir stood tall. "The story is not over," he said softly, a calm resolve in his voice. "It never ends. It lives in each of us." And so, the people around him, Jane, the neighbors, the community, came to understand. The meals, the stories, the traditions, these were not just for the sake of nostalgia. They were a bridge between the past and the future, between what had been and what could be. And as Amir shared his culture, his history, and his heritage, he realized that in doing so, he was no longer a man lost between two worlds. He was a man who had found his place in both. As the years passed, Amir became a storyteller, not just of the food he cooked, but of the life he had lived. The people who had once been strangers became his family, and together, they learned to honor the past while embracing the future. They celebrated the differences that made them unique, and in doing so, they created a world where memories, stories, and flavors could live forever. And so, Amir's life came full circle. He had started as a man lost in a foreign land, but in the end, he had found his way home. Not in the place where he had been born, but in the hearts of those who had welcomed him, embraced his culture, and learned to cherish the flavors of home. And with each dish he prepared, with each story he told, Amir knew that his ancestors were with him, proud of the bridge he had built, one meal at a time. The end was not the end. It was a new beginning, a new chapter in the story that would never truly end. Whispering Echo.